Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Ira Hughes, the Senior Director of Sales for Doodle Labs, all about drones, connectivity, secure data links, and whether the Pentagon's drone dominance initiative is moving too fast. And then we break down the latest collapse of the U.S. Iran ceasefire, China's provocative ballistic missile test, and all of the news from this week's high-stakes NATO summit. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I hope all of our listeners, wherever you are in the world, have survived the recent heat wave that we've had here in the Northeast U.S. We've got Vaughn, Cockayne, foreign affairs correspondent here at the Washington Times, back on the show this week, and we have a lot to talk about. If you feel like you don't know what's going on with the U.S. Iran ceasefire, don't worry. You're not alone. I feel that way too. And even President Trump now today says he doesn't know whether the U.S. is back at all at war with Iran. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And coming up later, I have a really interesting discussion with Ira Hughes from Doodle Labs, a company that's at the heart of the data links and connectivity of drones, those physical drones that don't work unless that data link and connectivity piece is secure and reliable. And I get down in the weeds with Ira Hughes about all of that. So drone nerds, of which I am most certainly one, definitely stay tuned. But before we get there, Vaughn, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Hi, Ben. Thanks for having me on again. So as you said up top, we're going to talk a little bit about Iran and what's going on, as much as we know, at the very least. It seems like the U.S. and Iran have been trading strikes at a more regular pace this week after several weeks of relative peace in the region. Retaliatory strikes have now reached sort of a dangerous circular phase where each response is deadlier than the last. The newest phase began earlier this week after Iran supposedly struck 3 commercial tankers traveling in Omani waters in the Strait of Hormuz, which is that crucial waterway that Iran has claimed sovereignty over and has kept effectively closed since early March. The U.S. military launched retaliatory strikes the same day, hitting at least 85 targets in Iran's south, mostly air defenses, radar, and command and control sites. And Central Command, which oversees military operations in the Middle East, says that the strikes are mostly intended to degrade Iran's ability to project power in the strait and stop commercial shipping. Iran responded just a few hours later with its own proportional strikes on U.S. military installations across the Gulf, specifically in Kuwait and Bahrain. And then Trump, when he was in Ankara, Turkey, for the NATO summit, sort of lashed out and had a really pessimistic attitude about the entire relationship with Iran, about the memorandum of understanding, about the future of peace talks, saying that he considered the ceasefire that was outlined in the memorandum of understanding signed last month to be, quote, over. The president had an overall attitude of pessimism, as I said, and said that the U.S. would likely carry out more strikes against Iran, and they did on Wednesday afternoon, striking at least 90 targets, so more than the previous strike, targeting mostly the same sort of installations in southern Iran, including even near Iran's singular nuclear power plant in the south, and I believe a bridge, a train bridge connecting the capital city. And then Iran responded again just a few hours later with even more strikes in Bahrain and Kuwait, and importantly now in Jordan. So it's an expansion again. And the strikes have put serious doubt on the future of the memorandum and of a comprehensive peace deal at all between Iran and the United States. The two sides have only really met twice for negotiations under the memorandum, and only one of those was direct. However, Trump did tell reporters at the summit that he didn't rule out further negotiations, but he said that U.S. military strikes wouldn't last forever. And that it would just be a short sort of response, sort of like we had the last month when tensions flared up previously. So right now, like we said, we don't really know if we're at peace or we're at war again. And it's a frustrating position, to say the least, especially for the Gulf countries like Kuwait and Bahrain and Jordan that have already lost billions of dollars through damage from their energy infrastructure.
Yeah. It's so interesting. One of the subplots that I've been keeping an eye on, Vaughn, is just these calculations that Iran seems to be making, cost-benefit analyses, they're willing to live with military strikes, it seems like, against key capabilities that they have. And even if people get killed, it doesn't seem like they care particularly. They think it's worth it for them, to continue to show their power over the Strait of Hormuz as they see it. We're not okay with that same cost benefit analysis from the U.S. We don't want to see people get killed. We don't want to see stuff get destroyed and planes and drones shot down. So it's really interesting to see how they're sort of leveraging the tolerance for pain, if you want to call it that, because they're betting, and I think there's mounting evidence that they might be correct in this bet, that the U.S. is running out of moves faster than they are. And one of those moves is, of course, the defense industrial base here in the United States. And can we actually make more missile interceptors and munitions fast enough? Now, that was, as you mentioned, the NATO summit, Vaughn. That was one of the sort of the key themes hanging over that NATO summit, because we're watching the global defense industry kind of change right before our very eyes here. And I wonder if sort of this trouble that the U.S. defense industrial base has had keeping pace with all the conflicts around the world is part of it. We talk all the time about the U.S. industrial base, defense industrial base, but around the world, it's changing and ramping up in a real way. Our colleague Jan Patak, who works out of Ukraine, had a great piece this week in the Washington Times about the number of Ukrainian companies at the recent Satori defense show. Ukraine wants to be a defense supplier across Europe, not just a country that always has its handouts, sort of begging the U.S. for, U.S. and NATO for weapons, for missile interceptors, and for drone parts, and a bunch of other stuff. It believes it can build those drones, as it has now for a few years, along with electronic warfare capabilities and a bunch of other stuff for European nations. And we saw Ukrainian President Zelensky try to get Middle East countries to use Ukrainian-made counter-drone capabilities in the face of those Iranian attacks over the past couple of months. Now, the flip side of that is Ukraine, of course, needs more Patriot missile interceptors. And now, apparently, the Trump administration wants them to just make them themselves, because President Trump announced the U.S. will license the manufacturing of those Patriot missile defense batteries to Ukraine. A lot of companies have their hands in the Patriot system in one way or the other. Raytheon and its parent RTX, of course, are at the top of that chain, as is Lockheed Martin. I'm curious to learn more about the financials of how this new arrangement is going to work. I'm curious to see how the U.S. and Ukraine would propose to protect a Patriot missile production factory in Ukraine, which would immediately overnight become the number one target for the Russians to hit. So that's what we're watching here. And just one more note on this quickly, Vaughn. We saw a lot of other defense deals announced all around the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey this week. European countries are eager to show President Trump they're trying to spend more in defense. So there are deals around drones, missiles, cyber capabilities, and just a lot more kind of all over the place. So it's been interesting to watch this NATO summit emerge as not just a geopolitical gathering, but almost a de facto defense convention on the floor there in Ankara. That's been fascinating. But of course, the summit hasn't been all roses, that's for sure. I mean, the president went after Spain in a real way, and he resurrected this idea, Vaughn, of the U.S. controlling Greenland. I know you're plugged in at the State Department. Was this just kind of off-the-cuff rhetoric from the president as you see it, or is there some kind of renewed diplomatic push here with respect to Greenland?
Well, with the Greenland question, it's really maybe the perfect encapsulation of the tension between the United States and NATO right now. And there's supposed to be talks between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland over crafting a framework agreement over the future control over Greenland. And Trump's comments at the summit didn't really spark anything new, but they were interesting in the context of these new talks that were supposed to be started in January. So Trump, when talking to President Erdogan at the conference, basically said what he's already said before, that the United States should control Greenland, that the Arctic island country is too important to be controlled by Denmark, who doesn't spend enough on defense, according to the president, and that Russia and China's moves in the Arctic are too dangerous for Denmark and Greenland to control their own defense. And of course, it's in line with other security-related comments that Trump has said before concerning Greenland, and he brought up a sore spot of the U.S.-NATO relations at the summit. Trump even implied that NATO and Europe's response to U.S. claims over Greenland were behind his general souring of the alliance, and once again floated withdrawing U.S. troops from Europe in response. And while open conflict, between NATO members remains pretty remote, The obvious fractures here are troubling for those interested in European and Atlantic security. And what Trump comments mean for the supposed ongoing talks between the U.S. Denmark agreement is really unclear. Obviously, Greenland and Denmark's leaders predictably rejected the president's claims once again, as they've done over almost 2 years. Mette Frederiksen, the prime minister of Denmark, said that her country was willing to defend every inch of its territory. So, again, even though there's a lot of shift in Europe and NATO's response and trying to acquiesce to the president's desires for more defense spending, there's still, a level at which places like Denmark or Greenland are going to resist the president saying, we want to take over your territory.
Yeah. Look, it's one of those tension points inside NATO that we've been, that's it's just been basically a staple of U.S. foreign policy under the sort of the Trump era for the past decade. But it's not all just stemming from Trump's rhetoric. That's certainly a big part of it. But there are other major concerns here. One of them is Turkey and the F-35 program, which I've been writing extensively about for years. President Trump expressed support this week for allowing Turkey back into that program. For anybody who's not familiar, the F-35 fighter jet program, these are cutting-edge fighter jets, and the U.S. has had partnerships with a number of allies for years now, to the point where we're essentially training their pilots how to use the program and then allowing those countries to buy the F-35 to use. Israel, for example, is another one. Turkish pilots had been in the United States, like staying in the United States, learning how to fly F-35s, but they were kicked out of the program because Turkey also bought the Russian S-400 missile system. And the thinking in national security circles has always been that if you have a country that's using the F-35 and using the S-400, that could essentially allow the Russians to get a back door through Turkey into the F-35 and learn all of its security vulnerabilities and kind of compromise it as an air superiority platform that the U.S. and its NATO allies have. So Russia kind of getting into NATO through Turkey and basically rendering the F-35 moot is a huge deal. It's a really divisive issue. There have been a lot of folks, including a lot of Republicans and sort of folks on the more traditional conservative side, hawkish conservative side in the Republican Party, arguing against this. In fact, some people are arguing against having Turkey in NATO at all anymore at this point. We can, we could dedicate a whole other episode to Turkey's growing hostility toward Israel and a number of other factors that have kind of put it in this weird position inside NATO where it's still very much a member. It hosted the NATO summit this week, but there's a lot of tension all over the place with both other NATO countries and with the U.S. in some quarters, and certainly U.S. Allies. So we'll see where this goes. I'm curious to see if when the rubber really hits the road, if the Pentagon or the State Department are comfortable fully signing off on this and letting Turkey back into the program as they used to be, or if this was another example of the president maybe kind of saying something in principle that, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of the facts, doesn't actually materialize. And we are joined now by Ira Hughes, the Senior Director of Sales for Doodle Labs. And I'll let Ira tell you more about the company in just a second for anybody who doesn't know. But you have a really interesting background. You're at the forefront of a lot of issues around drones and all the connectivity that goes along with them. I want to hear more about your life as a team pilot for Major League Drone Racing. If we have a few seconds at the end of this interview, hopefully we can talk about that. But Ira, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Again, for Doodle Labs, if you don't know who Doodle Labs is, we facilitate the communications process between drones and robotics. We are able to provide long-range links as well as interconnectivity and MANET type solutions. So as the autonomy starts to take over and we start to see more swarm technologies, we'll be able to facilitate those as well. We've been around for a very long time and have some really key customers in the market.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that, because I know you have talked a lot about this idea of the data link as the backbone of any drone mission, and help us kind of understand, maybe for folks who don't think a lot about this, why connectivity, not just the physical drone itself, but why connectivity is kind of, especially increasingly these days, the difference between mission success or failure.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the data sheet for a drone, generally the amount of distance it can travel is based on the data link and how far it can stay connected to be able to give that ground to air connectivity or air to air connectivity, depending on the type of application they're using. And so a lot of drone companies can make a drone. They calculate how much battery they need to go X amount of distance based on the motors and the prop sizes. But then after they do that, they have to figure out, okay, how far can I keep in comms? How much data do I need to pass? What is the amount of drones in the air? And there's all these different ways that you have to calculate what that looks like. And that's a lot of times an afterthought, to be honest. And then I look at drones, like you said, as a physical space. Like there's four different components to drones, right? One is the flight controller. One is the video transmission system, which is us being the radio. One is the way you handle the video encoding, and then the other is just like the motors and frame and its typical setup, right, and payloads. But a lot of people skip that whole data transfer part, and then once they get to that piece, they don't have experts in it. Maybe there's somebody that came from the FPV world like me, or the hobbyist drone world, that wants to go start building drones, and they get into it and they know how to do analog, they know how to do these like simple system setups, but then they need to get into a more exquisite, complicated drone. And this part's a lot more complicated when it comes to calculating all of these different pieces.
We're going to talk a lot about drones and connectivity as this conversation unfolds here. As we record this on Wednesday, July 8th, there's a NATO summit happening in Turkey, or I guess it's wrapping up right about now. And of course, the Russia-Ukraine war has been a central theme there. And within that conflict is the fact that drones have exploded, of course, to the forefront of modern day combat. But I'm curious where we are, or kind of where you see sort of the landscape in terms of the drone versus counter drone technology today, whether we're talking about electronic warfare, EW, or some kind of other capabilities designed to stop drones. Where is that dynamic headed? Kind of what's the next, what's over the horizon, if you will, on that dynamic?
Yeah, and that's a never ending cat and mouse game, like they like to say, right? Like there's always a combination of EW that's happening, electronic warfare, which is whether it's jamming, whether it's spoofing, whether it's jamming the GPS systems to try to keep their navigations, or spoofing the GPS systems. A lot of time when an attack happens, depending where you're at in that theater, all of a sudden your GPS coordinates will go to some other place in the world, because they're actually giving you fake coordinates, right? And so all of those different ways of combating location data is interesting. But then on the radio side, it gets more and more complicated, because the Ukrainian side is jamming one set of frequencies, the Russian side is jamming another set of frequencies, and you're trying to figure out how you stay in comms with your connection at the same time.
That's a great point, and not to get too far down in the weeds of sort of military to military or interoperability, but I'm just curious. I mean, when you start talking about, as I mentioned, there's a NATO summit happening right now. If you start introducing multiple countries, or in a Pacific, God forbid, a Pacific clash with China, when all of a sudden the U.S. is trying to communicate with the South Koreans or the Philippines military, or the Japanese, the Australians, it seems like that could kind of compound on itself rather quickly if you have a bunch of different systems or a bunch of different militaries all trying to figure out who's jamming where, who's communicating where. How do you guard against that in today's threat environment, today's combat scenarios?
Yeah, I think at least I know how we do it is by having a very wide spectrum of frequencies available per radio, and then having a very smart way of intelligently deciding whether or not the frequency you're on is good or not, and quickly moving to one that is, because the frequency environment is going to be constantly shifting depending on what drone you're near, what drones are up, what jammers are in action, where you're located. It's constantly a dynamic problem that you have to solve. And so that's something we work on a lot, and why we work very closely with the current conflicts and the people that are in the current conflicts, and getting that feedback back so that we can constantly iterate. They're saying in Ukraine, it's a 3-week iteration cycle now. And so they're constantly redeveloping what they're doing every 3 weeks. And it's being done on the same other side with Rubicon from Russia.
How sort of what level can some of these counter drone technologies be deployed? Because I know in covering the Iran war, some of my colleagues and myself, heard from sources that one of the reasons that the Trump administration ultimately decided not to put ground troops in Iran was that we were worried about swarms of Shaheds and how we were going to actually counter that at a unit level. If we were on a place like Karg Island, we didn't want to see a lot of Marines or soldiers getting picked apart by Iranian drones. Are we at a place where, whether it's, EW or something, directly kinetic, do we have, in your view, the ability to sort of combat that at that level right now, or is that still a little bit off in the distance?
Yeah, very interesting question. The Ukrainians are working really hard on this for the last year. About a year ago, about 9 months ago, they switched really hard into really investing almost all of the drone manufacturers into the interceptor systems, and everybody's focus went to that. There was large awards by the Ukrainian military that were given from European sponsors to be able to come up with these interceptors that could help with the Shahid problem. Well, what's interesting about that is they're knocking 90+% of the Shahids down. They're coming into Kyiv now and around the country because they have these new interceptors. And the Russians has had to change their tactics because they're not as effective as they used to be. And they kept making them different, right? So they originally got the designs from Iran, and then they modified them, and then they sent them, and they were with like props. They only went at like 150 kilometers per hour. And then they put jets on them. Now they went 300 kilometers per hour, and we constantly had to iterate and keep up. That's that 3-week change cycle. And so now you're starting to see drones come out from companies like Quantum, who just announced, I believe, 600 kilometer per hour interceptor drones. And so as we start to see these increases in capabilities, the Shahid is no longer that big of a threat anymore in Ukraine. Obviously, 6% getting through is a horrible thing, but it is not the same as what happened in Iran at all. And so how they are handling that in Iran versus how they handle that on a daily basis in Ukraine is completely different. And the West doesn't even understand how to deal with it. That's why, Zelensky made a beautiful move and went over to the Middle East and said, hey, we'll protect you. Just give us Patriots, because they just had, I think it was 17 ballistic missiles fired into Kyiv. They weren't able to stop any of them because they don't have enough Patriot missiles. Give us some Patriots and we'll keep them from hitting you with Shahids, right?
Yeah. No, it's so funny you mentioned that. And just this morning, a couple of hours before we record this, we see President Trump announce he's going to allow Ukraine to license and basically manufacture Patriots themselves. So I do think that kind of played into that broader dynamic, because it's just such a great example of what we've actually learned tangibly from the Ukrainians in terms of defending against these drones. Because as you say, the United States and other Western nations have a lot to learn about that from a country that's had to deal with it in its face in the front lines for years now. Speaking of drones, the Drone Dominance Initiative inside the Pentagon. We talk a lot about this here at Threat Status, this plan to field hundreds of thousands of small drones by next year, 2027. Aerial drones, but maritime as well, unmanned surface vessels, undersea systems, but specifically on drone dominance as kind of a program. What concerns you as this effort really starts to scale up? Do you think there's a risk that some of these security vulnerabilities or insecure data links or something else are kind of might get baked into this because we're racing so fast to scale up?
It's a great question. And I think it's a very dynamic situation as well, in that we're building the plane while we're flying it, right? Kind of that scenario, in that the United States knows that it needs some capability when it comes to FPV strike drones, right? And FPV strike drones have continued to evolve in Ukraine, and there's still a ton of them that are piloted autonomously, like I fly when I race. There's a lot that are flown non-autonomously, right? They're flown in acro mode, right? But as the need progresses and as the range changes, a lot of those FPV drones are changing, right? So still a ton of those are being deployed today, but what we're starting to see there is a lot more mid to long range strike drones being more effective. But in the US right now, we're focused on that front piece. And so drone dominance program that you're referring to, the smaller program of drone dominance for the small FPVs, is focused on those systems. I have strong feelings that the drones that we're going to acquire, at least in the first few phases, won't be drones that will actually work in a battlefield scenario if you were to send those to Ukraine. But I do think that those drones will be good for training our forces, getting us started, and stressing our U.S. ecosystem, because they have to be manufactured with a certain amount of U.S. parts. And as the gauntlets continue, more and more of those parts have to be U.S. sourced. And so I do believe that it's a really good exercise to make sure that we have the manufacturing capabilities if we went to war against China tomorrow, for the U.S. to be able to make those parts.
It's such a great point. I think it's often missed when we talk about scaling these things up, is that it's very hard to go from effectively 0 to 100 sort of overnight. You do have to have those steps in between where we're going to be making things that maybe aren't going to accomplish everything we want or be as secure in this area or do exactly what we want over here. But we need to do it. We need to actually build them and actually get physical things into the hands of warfighters, so then we know what needs to be improved and where we go from there. It seems like it's really hard to kind of fake that until you actually do it.
Yeah, and even if these drones, like I said, are the stepping stone to get us to the next level of drones that I think are going to be effective in the battlefield, then it's a good step because where are we going to get motors other than China? Now we're starting to make some of those here. Where are we going to get flight controllers other than China? Companies like Arc Electronics, they make all US made stuff. They're going to be stressed trying to get as many units as they need to be able to fulfill the US demand for parts that's required for these types of systems. And so I do believe that it's a great exercise, again, in stressing that supply chain as a whole to figure out where the holes are and figure out where we need to prop up those holes so the U.S. can stand solid on being able to be their own drone manufacturers and be able to manufacture their own parts here.
This might sound like a kind of a 101 level question to somebody in your position, but I think it's important as a concept for listeners to kind of understand. It's this idea of distance. I know you all at Doodle Labs talk about how you offer, stable data links maintained over 200 miles in real world flight tests. So 200 miles away. And that's really important when you start to talk about the Pacific theater, for example, and the U.S. military wanting to sort of push the front line away from human beings, whether that's on land, at sea, or in the air. Can you just kind of tie together for listeners how this is actually sort of a real world, tangible combat scenario benefit to the United States, actually having the ability for these things to function at those great distances? Why is that so important from a strategic point of view for the U.S. military?
Absolutely. If you look at distance as a whole, there's a number of factors that determine distance, right? And range just comes at a cost from physics and from dollars. And so for one example is we need to figure out how much data they need to pass, right? How can they squeeze the sensor payload data, whether it's video or, LiDAR or whatever else they want to send back to the ground, into the smallest amount of data as possible so they can go the farthest as possible, because the farther you go, the less carriers you have in the air to be able to actually transmit that data on, right? And so the way we overcome that is by passive gain, which is bigger antennas, which come at a cost. Everything in wireless is trade-off, right? So those come at a cost. If it's a larger ground station, then it's a larger target for them to be able to take out. Or you can do active gain by using amplifiers, and then amplifiers then just cost extra, right? So you take a base radio and then you Lego block on all the pieces you need, whether it's bigger antennas, it's more amplification. And then when you add them all together, then you get those ranges that we're talking to. And, again, talking in comparisons for Indo-PACOM versus, Ukraine today is when we started working with them about a year and a half ago, when I really actively started selling into that region, they were saying 30 kilometers is the max they're going to need for strike stuff. And now they're saying 50 to 60 kilometers is short range, right? And 50 to 150 is mid range. And then long range is like, somewhere between 150 and 250, and anything maybe over 250 to 1,000 is three strike, depending on the person you talk to. And those are ranges that they're doing all day, every day. And the reason why those are specifically important to them to have at a data link level is because, everyone knows they're using a ton of Starlink out there. But we also know that they're very limited now on where they can and can't use the Starlink. They can only use the Starlink up to the border of Russia. And so if they want to strike into Russia, they can't use Starlink anymore. So they're having to go back to these typical radio connections, and they're going to need these long range links to be able to effectively hit those logistics as they push them farther and farther back into Russia. And so it could be the same when it comes to the systems they're using and what they aren't limited to in that war as well, if that were to ever come.
Right. You mentioned, I think you used the phrase like sort of Lego blocking things on top. I'm curious, we had Lieutenant General Chris Mohan from Army Materiel Command on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he talks a lot about 3D printing parts, components of drones, in the Pacific, for example, as one way to kind of bridge those distances so you're not having to ship stuff literally to the other side of the world. From a security perspective, secure data link perspective, do you start to get worried if we have parts of drones being 3D printed on site halfway around the world by, Army soldiers somewhere? Does that introduce any kind of vulnerabilities, whether it's to the physical drone itself, making it less reliable, or the connectivity that sort of guides it? Does that raise any concerns from your point of view if we start printing parts of these in different disparate locations around the world?
Yeah, not at all. I think that, being able to decentralize your manufacturing process and bring it to the front line, like the guys at Firestorm are doing, it's a really good solution. A lot of the drone parts in Ukraine are 3D printed also because of the iteration cycle that they have. They just don't have the time to go actually get those cut out, do it in different ways. Like they have to figure out with what they have in their hands and do it as quickly as possible. And companies like Firestorm, the materials that they're using for these 3D printing is very rigid. And it's not like your home 3D printer type stuff where they're printing with, ABS or PETG or any of those things. They're printing some really solid substrates that allow them to have the rigidity that they need to produce these. And so it's going to continually be a way that we see additive production all around the world and in space.
Ira, we could spend probably 15 minutes talking about this next question that I'm going to close on, but I'm just curious to sort of bring everything full circle to where we started here. At the heart of the U.S. strategy in the Pacific is this hellscape idea that Pacific Command Commander Admiral Sampoparro has talked about, just tons and tons of drones crowding the sky and the sea to stop China from being able to operate there and, for example, maybe invade Taiwan. So going back to that connectivity piece, I mean, when we start talking about the sheer numbers that we're talking about here, what's the biggest challenge in trying to make that system of systems work? That if you're talking about all the different uncrewed systems at different altitudes, in the water, under the water, make different sizes, different missions, different capabilities, different Lego blocks, as you said, on board each of them. How hard is that from a challenge of making that all work and being confident that it will work when you need it to?
From a logistics standpoint, it's very hard. Because there's just not enough spectrum available to be able to operate the amount of vehicles that they want to operate in theory today. That being said, we're starting to see the beginning of swarming technologies that allow for many vehicles to be able to communicate at a much lower throughput because they're making decisions on the edge rather than having to have the communications and the directions come from the ground station. So as we start to see more autonomous systems, we're going to be able to see the multiplication of systems. And so that's going to take a lot of the burden off of the data link. But I believe that you're going to have a very distributed amount of how you move your data across those systems. And it's going to be a mix of satellite, cellular, and ground data links to be able to cover all of those systems and be able to achieve the goals at the numbers that they want to achieve with the mass numbers that would need to be deployed to make sure that that hellscape happens. But I would say that in the last year and a half, I haven't seen a ton of large number of systems actually being deployed. There's a lot of theories, there's a lot of talking about it. But in the last 3 months or so, I have seen a number of systems that are being developed that are very exciting and are definitely looking at it in a way that I think is now doable.
That's a good point. Ira Hughes from Doodle Labs, thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for your time.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where we each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all listen to the show. Vaughn, what do you have for us as your threat of the week?
My threat of the week this week, Ben, are these reports that Russia is reportedly ramping up its efforts to jam Ukraine's mid-strike drone assaults by deploying to the front line new jammers to disrupt the Starlink connection between these drones. I guess they're termed the Volna Kupol Garant jammers, and apparently they give off these massive detectable electronic signatures. So even though they are able to, at least temporarily, disrupt the connection between Ukraine's cheap and effective mid-strike drones with Starlink, they ultimately are opening themselves up for even more targets for Ukraine, as Ukraine itself looks to damage Russian fuel depots and air defense sites and command posts well beyond the front lines. And, the thing that's interesting about this is it actually tracks with other issues surrounding drone warfare that we've covered at Threat Status before, where the anti-drone option ends up being far more expensive for the defender than the thing it's intended to counter in the first place, where these jammers themselves are likely far more expensive to replace than the cheap and pretty effective mid-strike drones that Ukraine has been deploying against targets within Russia.
Yeah, the cost aspect to all of that just continues to be front and center when you're talking about drones and counter-drone capabilities and jamming. It's hard to kind of make that math work when you're trying to figure out what to do with these things in large numbers. My threat of the week is this test launch of a nuclear-capable Chinese submarine-launched ballistic missile. Our colleague and friend of the show, Bill Gertz, has been all over this story, which apparently involves a KL-2 underwater launched missile. Really interesting side note to this, some Taiwanese officials posted on social media what they say is a flight map, essentially, the flight path of this missile, including that it flew over Guam. So really interesting. Take a look at that if you have a second. This is a big deal. It's the first missile test of this kind, nuclear-capable ballistic missile, since 2024, and the timing of this is never a coincidence. The major military exercise RIMPAC, Rim of the Pacific, going on right now, involving the U.S. and a bunch of other countries. We, of course, had the NATO summit, and, China, while not necessarily the driving number one concern for NATO, is always hanging over any discussion about global security. So maybe China just wanted attention. We've seen North Korea do that plenty of times in the past when they feel like the U.S. isn't giving them their due, fire a missile into the Pacific Ocean. But it's the nuclear aspect here, Vaughn, that's really dangerous. That's what the State Department latched onto in its statement about the test, accusing China of nuclear proliferation. It's actually testing nuclear-capable missiles in the ocean. There's a lot of talk, of course, about the U.S. conducting nuclear tests, resuming nuclear tests. This isn't the exact same thing as detonating a nuclear weapon underground on land, but they're, of course, related. And what's even more dangerous is what it could mean doctrinally, because there's a lot of experts and China watchers who believe Beijing is in the process now of abandoning its doctrine, its idea of no first use of nuclear weapons, and could actually be opening the door to using one in an offensive way in some future conflict. I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly not impossible given this week's test, Vaughn, and that's why it's my threat of the week. And with that, a huge thanks, Vaughn. Great episode, and a big thanks to Ira Hughes from Doodle Labs for that really good deep dive into drones and connectivity. And most of all, a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and we will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.